What if I told you that the darkest moments of your life could become the foundation of your greatest triumphs? That the very struggles threatening to break you might actually be forging your strongest self? Today we're diving deep into one of humanity's most powerful forces, the will to rise. Through timeless stories and profound lessons, we'll explore how ordinary people transform extraordinary suffering into unstoppable strength. This isn't just another motivational video. This is a journey through the human spirit itself, raw, honest, and ultimately transformative. Let me tell you about a man who lost everything, not just his wealth, not just his status, but his very identity. Picture this, a successful businessman, respected in his community, living what seemed like a perfect life. Then in a single moment, it all crumbled. This reminds me of the archetypal stories we've read throughout history. Tales of individuals who faced seemingly insurmountable odds. The beauty of these narratives isn't in their uniqueness, but in their universality. They reflect struggles we all face, magnified and crystallized into unforgettable lessons. The man I'm thinking of, let's call him Samuel, had built his life on external validation. His self-worth was tied to his bank account, his reputation, his ability to provide. When the financial crisis hit, when his business collapsed, when friends turned away, he didn't just lose his livelihood, he lost himself. For months, Samuel lived in a fog of despair. He'd wake up each morning feeling like he was drowning in his own bed. The weight of failure pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd stare at the ceiling, wondering how he'd face another day of phone calls from creditors, another day of his children asking why they had to move to a smaller apartment. But here's what's fascinating about rock bottom. It's solid. When you've fallen as far as you can fall, when there's nowhere left to go but up, something remarkable happens. The human spirit begins to stir. Not immediately, not dramatically, but like a seed buried in winter soil, waiting for the right moment to break through. Samuel's turning point came not through some grand revelation, but through the smallest act of kindness. A neighbor, knowing his struggles, brought over a simple meal. No words of pity, no lectures about pulling himself up by his bootstraps, just a warm plate of food and a quiet, "I thought you might be hungry." That night, for the first time in months, Samuel didn't just eat food, he tasted it. He felt the warmth, the care, the reminder that he was still human, still worthy of compassion. And in that moment, something shifted. The tiniest spark of hope flickered to life. The ancient Greeks had a word, anagnorisis, the moment of recognition or discovery. It's that pivotal instant when a character suddenly sees their situation clearly, often for the first time. Samuel's anagnorisis came not in a flash of lightning, but in the quiet realization that his worth wasn't determined by his circumstances. This is where our story intersects with one of literature's most powerful themes, the journey from despair to hope. Think about the greatest stories ever told. They don't celebrate characters who never fall. They celebrate those who rise again. Samuel began to notice things he'd overlooked during his years of success. The way morning light filtered through his apartment window, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the strength in his wife's eyes, not just enduring their struggles, but somehow finding beauty in their simplicity. He started taking walks, not because he had anywhere to go, but because movement felt like progress. During these walks, he began to see his neighborhood differently. The elderly man who always sat on his porch wasn't just a fixture. He was a person with stories, with wisdom earned through decades of his own rises and falls. One day, Samuel stopped and introduced himself. The man's name was Frank, and he'd been watching Samuel's daily walks with quiet understanding. "You remind me of myself 40 years ago," Frank said with a knowing smile. Same lost look, same heavy shoulders. Frank shared his own story, not of continuous success, but of multiple failures, each one teaching him something essential about resilience. He'd lost jobs, relationships, even his health at various points. But each setback had revealed something about his character he didn't know existed. The problem, Frank explained, is that we're taught to see failure as the opposite of success. But that's not true. Failure is just success that hasn't happened yet. It's the raw material of greatness. This conversation became the first of many. Frank became Samuel's unofficial mentor, not through grand speeches or complex philosophies, but through simple presence and hard-earned wisdom. He taught Samuel that the will to rise isn't about never falling. It's about developing the courage to stand up one more time than you fall down. But understanding the path and walking it are two different things. Samuel's journey wasn't a straight line from despair to triumph. It was messy, complicated, filled with setbacks and small victories that felt enormous in the moment. The first step was confronting his pride. Samuel had to swallow his ego and take a job that paid a fraction of what he'd once earned. The work was physically demanding, the hours long, the pay barely enough to cover basic expenses. But something unexpected happened. He began to find dignity in honest work. There's a profound lesson here about the nature of worth. We live in a culture that measures value by external markers, salary, title, possessions. But real worth, the kind that sustains you through dark times, comes from something deeper. It comes from your willingness to keep going when keeping going is hard. Samuel's hands grew calloused, his back ached, his pride bruised daily. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his sense of self began to rebuild, not on the foundation of what he owned, but on what he could endure, what he could overcome, what he could become. The nights were the hardest. When the physical exhaustion faded and the mental noise quieted, doubt would creep in. Is this all there is now? Will I ever recover? Have I failed my family forever? These questions haunted Samuel, but they also forged him. Each night he wrestled with despair and chose hope instead. He was building spiritual muscle. The will to rise isn't a one-time decision. It's a choice made over and over, sometimes moment by moment. His wife Sarah became his anchor during these storms. She never pretended their situation was easy, never offered false optimism. Instead, she offered something more valuable, unwavering presence. "We're in this together," she'd say simply. "Whatever comes, we face it together." This partnership became crucial to Samuel's transformation. He realized that the will to rise doesn't have to be a solitary journey. Sometimes our greatest strength comes from allowing others to help carry the load, from recognizing that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of genuine connection. 18 months into his journey, Samuel barely recognized himself. Not because his circumstances had dramatically changed. He was still working the same demanding job, still living in the same modest apartment, but everything had changed because he had changed. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was like watching a tree grow, imperceptible day by day, but undeniable over time. Samuel had developed what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people don't just recover from trauma, but actually become stronger than they were before. This is where literature's greatest stories reveal their deepest truths. The heroes we remember aren't those who never faced adversity. They're those who faced it and were transformed by it. They discovered that within them lay reserves of strength they never knew existed. Samuel's outlook shifted fundamentally. Problems that once seemed insurmountable now felt like puzzles to solve. Setbacks that once crushed his spirit now became data points in his ongoing education. He'd learned to see obstacles not as barriers, but as opportunities to practice resilience. The moment Samuel knew he'd truly changed came during a particularly difficult day at work. A newer employee, struggling with the physical demands of the job, looked ready to quit. Samuel saw himself 2 years earlier in that man's frustrated expression. Instead of walking past, Samuel stopped. He shared his own story, not the sanitized version, but the raw truth about fear, doubt, and the daily choice to keep going. He offered practical advice about the work, but more importantly, he offered hope. "The person you are today," Samuel told him, "isn't the person you have to be tomorrow. Every day is a chance to write a new chapter." As Samuel spoke those words, he realized he was no longer just surviving his circumstances. He was using them to serve others. His pain had become his purpose. His struggles had become his strength. The will to rise had transformed from a personal necessity into a gift he could offer the world. Samuel's external circumstances did eventually improve. Through persistence, additional training, and the reputation he'd built for reliability and character, he found better opportunities. But by then, he understood something crucial. His happiness wasn't dependent on external success. This is the paradox of the will to rise. When you stop needing external validation to feel worthy, you often find that external success follows naturally. Not because the universe rewards good people, but because you've developed the character traits that create opportunities. Samuel's story reminds us that the will to rise isn't about returning to where you were before. It's about becoming who you were meant to be. Sometimes we need to lose everything we think we need to discover everything we actually are. The man who lost his business became someone who could help others find their strength. The man who lost his status became someone who understood that true worth comes from character, not circumstances. The man who lost his way became someone who could guide others through their own dark nights of the soul. Years later, Samuel would look back on that period of his life not as the worst time, but as the most important time. Not because the suffering was good, but because his response to it revealed capacities he never knew he possessed. He'd learned that the will to rise isn't about avoiding failure. It's about transforming failure into wisdom. It's about taking the raw material of your worst moments and forging them into your greatest strengths. As we close this journey together, I want you to consider your own story. Where are you right now? Are you in your valley, wondering if you'll ever see the mountaintop again? Are you climbing, one difficult step at a time? Or are you looking back, grateful for the journey that brought you strength? Wherever you are, remember this: the will to rise isn't a destination, it's a way of traveling. It's the choice to see each setback as a setup for a comeback. It's the decision to let your struggles teach you rather than defeat you. The most beautiful thing about the human spirit is its capacity for renewal. No matter how many times you've fallen, no matter how deep the valley, no matter how impossible the climb seems, you have within you the power to rise again. Your story isn't over. Your best chapters might still be unwritten. And sometimes the very thing that breaks you open is what allows the light to get in. Thank you for joining me on this journey. The will to rise lives in all of us. The question isn't whether you have it, the question is whether you'll choose to use it. Your climb starts now.